dear Dr. Sarah Williams Goldhagen. So, I am greeting you in our framework of our project City as a Classroom. I have prepared some questions for you and we can start. Okay, so my first question. How does the environment we create shape our feelings, memories, and well-being?
When you first shared that question with me, I was a little taken aback, I have to admit, because I wrote a 300+ page book about that. And so it's a little hard to figure out how to summarize, but so I thought what I would start with by way of discussing that is just to pick apart the question a little bit, which is how does the environment shape our feelings, thoughts, and emotions? Is that it? So one is first, let's say, what is the environment? And I say things, this may be sort of obvious, but I think given the topic of your conference, it's worth emphasizing. And when you say the city is a classroom, I think effectively for thinking about human environmental experience in the 21st century, cities are mostly what we have. We all know the figures from the World Health Organization and the UN about increasing urbanization, and these trends are not going to stop, even with the pandemic, even with everything else. The long-term trends are that living will be urban living, and all urban living is in the built environment, even when you're in parks and so on, because it's all designed, and it's all designed by humans. So, okay, so I just want to clarify what we mean when we say the word environment. That's what I mean. I mean the built environment. And the second word in that sentence that I wanted to talk a little bit about was shape, which is, you don't want to say determine. Do things in the built environment determine how people behave? Well, you can't really say that. We certainly can't say it with confidence, and we definitely can't say it with evidence, because there are many determinants of human behavior and many determinants of including genes and genetic heritage and upbringing and so on and so forth. So shape is a good word because it suggests that the built environment, because that's what we're talking about, has a substantive impact on people's inner life and physical life. We'll talk more about that in a second. And this we can say with confidence. We now know that this is correct, and we know this, and you'll ask me about interdisciplinarity in a bit, but we know this only when we look at the information available about the impacts, the effects of the built environment on people in a highly interdisciplinary way. We have to grab from social sciences, physical sciences, medical sciences, public health, sociology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so we know there's a substantive impact. How big is that impact? Number one. Number two, can we discuss it? How big the impact is, even the Center for Disease Control in the United States, which has a whole chart and section on social determinants of health, that's just health, of public health, really. If you look closely at those charts, they say the built environment, the deterministic effects of the built environment on health is about 10%. But then if you really look at that chart and you scrutinize it, you realize it's much closer to 50 or 60 or 70%, because the other categories are things like type of neighborhood you live in. Well, that's an urban question, right? Access to green space, that's an urban question, and so on and so forth. So, okay. And then the last part is, physical health, mental health, well-being, emotions, and so on. And we just have, again, you have to grab from a lot of different disciplines, but we have information, explicit, scientifically confirmed studies showing the effects of different things in the built environment, and particularly built environmental design, on, let's say, people's emotions. For example, the feeling of awe, which, you know, not everybody has had this experience, but if you walk into the Hagia Sophia, or you walk into Amiens, French Gothic Cathedral, or something like that, there's this kind of sense of awe, is what we call it, you know, a sort of feeling overwhelmed, a kind of feeling both smallness and yet serene at the same time. That's an established emotion in the human repertoire of emotions. And we know that certain types of spaces instigate it. And we also know that once a person feels a sense of awe, that all sorts of behavioral consequences follow. For example, people are much more inclined to think pro-socially after they've experienced awe. That's a psychological term. And much more likely to engage in pro-social behaviors, which they test by things, I don't remember the exact study, what they did, but it's sort of things like, do you share a pencil or do you not share a pencil? You know, whatever. They cooperate with each other more. They feel a sense of community. And they also have a sense that humans are a small part of something that's much bigger than they are, which is part of the way that this sense of community happens. Okay, so that's one small, very clear-cut example in which the built environmental experience makes you have an emotion, and that emotion changes your behavior. Okay, you're going from emotions to physical health. I mean, the most clear-cut example we have here is a pretty well-known one, but I still think it's a powerful one. And then there are all sorts of sub-studies that have come from it, which is the effect of views of nature or sunlight on people. Let's take sunlight. I mean, we know that sunlight has physiologically, you need it. You need vitamin D, you need to be able to see, et cetera, et cetera. There are studies that show that patients in mental health hospitals who are put in rooms that have more sunlight recover from mania more quickly than patients who are put in rooms with less sunlight. Even more than that, we have information that suggests that patients who are put in rooms that have more sunlight that comes in the morning heal more quickly than patients who have the same amount of sunlight as the first group of patients, but this afternoon sunlight. Okay, so these are physiological effects. And there are people working on circadian rhythms and the interaction of circadian rhythms to human psychology and so on. It's a totally fascinating field. Now that's just, and here I've just taken the smallest slice of one little part of a design problem for any architect, which is light. Okay, so well-being is interesting because it's comprised of psychological components and physical components. But one example that I thought of when I was sort of thinking more about, I mean, obviously, if you're not physically healthy, you're going to experience less of a sense of well-being, right? Okay, but there's more to it than that. There's a kind of psychological sense of calm, let's say, that goes along with it, or control. Okay, so let's take those two words, calm, number one, and control, number two. This comes from evolutionary psychology. Humans are wired to want to have control over their environments, okay? For obvious reasons, right? There were a lot of bad guys out there. we wanted to protect ourselves from the bears and the this and the that and so on. And the best way to do that is to arrange ourselves in an environment where we could see things and control access in and out and so on and so forth. So the need for control over our physical environments is deeply wired in us. At the same time, we also want to be stimulated positively. That's, I mean, what makes humans so distinctive is how smart we are, right? And how our brains grow is by constantly processing new and different kinds of information, and sort of being challenged. And, you know, it's just like everybody hates being bored, right? And everybody wants, now you want different levels of stimulation depending upon what you're doing in the day and, you know, and all sorts of things. But people need that kind of stimulation. Okay, so control stimulation. Well, those are architectural problems. Control is an architectural problem because, let's say, I'm thinking of a terrible space in the United States, in New York City, which is Penn Station. You walk into Penn Station, it's totally confusing. It's like this huge stadium-like loft area, but with really low ceilings and people moving everywhere and no clear sense of where you're going to go. And it's very unnerving. That's just plain bad design. And better design can shift that. Okay, so another design way to afford people a sense of control is to give them what evolutionary psychologists call a sense of refuge. There's this kind of couplet that people talk about a lot called prospect and refuge. And you need both. You need places to go out and forage and look for food and get new stimulation and stuff like that. And you also need places to retreat and rest and regain your resources and so on and so forth. Again, totally a design problem. And these, I want to emphasize that, you know, well-being has sort of been co-opted by corporate entities and transformed into a commodity. And, you know, okay, that's how our economy works. But it's a basic human need. It's not like getting your nails done. You know, well-being is something that people thrive, they grow better, they develop cognitively better, and so on when their sense of well-being is enhanced. So, okay, so these are sort of fundamental human needs. Sorry, I think I'll stop there, and I'm sure more will come back as we keep talking.
How would you describe the current condition and knowledge of architects today?
That's a really broad question. And, you know, obviously most of my experience has been with architects in Western Europe, really in the United States, and in architectural education in the United States. So the knowledge base, I don't think that a person becomes an architect. Most people, not all, without having a fair amount of optimism that they're going to do something that's going to help, and you know, and make things better somehow. Now, as I said, there are of course exceptions, and you may be thinking of them, as am I. But so what I want to say is that I have, over my many years of working with architects, they are enormously earnest, most of them. They want to know a lot, and I think that because of the structure of what they're being asked to do, number one, and because of the structure of their education, number two, they do know a lot, but they don't always know everything they should know. That would help them do really what I call human-centered design. Design that emerges out of a deep and profound knowledge of human psychological and physical needs and sociological needs, growth, and so on and so forth. Okay, so and they're interested in all of this, but to be an architect is to be a jack of many trades and a master of few. You have to know a lot of different kinds of things to be an architect, or to put differently, the way people often do is, you have to know a little about a lot of things. And so it doesn't, once you get out of school and into the world, the profession is so relentless that no matter how earnest you are, it doesn't give you a whole lot of time to stop and breathe and learn the kinds of things I'm talking about. Maybe a book here or there. Okay, so that leads us to education, which is, and in architectural education, at least in the United States and in most places in Europe, although not all, and things are changing, in the States too, there is a fair amount of resistance to taking seriously the challenge of learning and figuring out how to use the information that I'm talking about. And I get it. Everybody's busy. They do have to learn structures. They have to learn all this other stuff. HVAC is also important, but you are designing for human beings. And there is a lot of information out there about physiologically, emotionally, psychologically, about how people thrive and do best. And if you want to do better design, you need to know that stuff and keep learning it all along. And the reasons why there's so much resistance have a lot to do with the history of the profession and the kind of split between the Beaux-Arts and the schools of technology and the engineering schools. I think but it's, enough is enough, it's over. It's really time to move on and to update the profession.
How does architecture affect the human unconsciousness, or what is the connection between them?
So first, let's start with the word unconscious, which it's not a word I use in my own work, writing or verbal. Because it has Freudian overtones to it. And, for Freud, the unconscious was something that you could never really access, or only in very, very small flashes. And it was like this dark force that was underneath it all, you know what I'm talking about. We know a lot more about cognition than we knew when Freud was writing, for all sorts of reasons. And yes, of course, there are parts of the unconscious that are like that. But what I'm really interested in is what I call non-conscious cognition, which is that huge range of cognitions. And when I say cognition, I also mean emotions, because emotions are cognitions. That huge range of cognitions that we're not aware of at any given moment, but that are flowing through us and helping to shape what we do and how we think. And the distinction is important because non-conscious cognitions are cognitions of which you can become aware, unlike unconscious cognitions, where you can't. And, most cognitive linguists and, people who study cognition now think that about 80 to 90% of all human cognition is non-conscious. Okay, so there's a lot going on that we're not aware of. Now, what does that mean effectively? And what does that mean when you come to thinking about how people experience the built environment? There's a concept in psychology, there are two concepts. One comes from environmental psychology, the other comes from a different kind of psychology. Which one do I do first? Okay, one is called priming. And there are many, many priming studies in psychology. And a very famous one, which you may know, is they asked people to pretend they were human resources hiring someone. And each human resources, who was really a study participant, interviewed two candidates, and during one interview, they were just sitting there, and before the second interview started, the study leader would come in and say, oh, I thought maybe you'd want a cup of coffee, and would hand the person a warm cup of coffee. And the person would hold the mug that was very warm. And what they found is that holding a warm cup of coffee, a warm mug, skewed their assessments of how warm, emotionally, the people they were interviewing were. So, so when you go to a job interview, bring a cup of coffee to your interviewer, right? Because they'll like you better. They'll think you're a better person or a friendlier person in any case. Okay, so that's a prime. There's no way that person could ever know that their social judgment was being influenced by the physical sensation of a warm coffee cup. But it was. And there are all sorts of others. I mean, this goes back to the 1960s. You know, they used to tell us when I was a kid, they used to tell us that they put things like, you know, shadowy naked women in ice cubes and liquor ads, because then, you know, there would be sex there and you would buy it. But it's a real phenomenon. And it happens all the time. And if you think about, well, okay, so how does this relate to the built environment? Well, we're being primed all the time. We're being primed to look out the window, go outside, go upstairs, go downstairs, sit up, stand down, you know, touch the wood, touch the brick, whatever. So we're just being bombarded with primes, and we have no idea most of this is going on. There's all sorts of other things I could say, but I don't have time to say that. Okay, so the second part of this is a term in environmental psychology called affordances. And this is the concept that we respond, but perception happens. And that means perception of the built environment, the places we live and inhabit. Perception happens through a non-conscious process by which we assess what certain objects can be used for and develop goals around whether or not to use them. The simple example is a chair, right? What a chair is an affordance. What is the activity that a chair affords? Sitting, right? Or throwing it across the room at your professor because you don't like her. Okay, so if you think about objects sort of communicating to you, but not necessarily verbally communicating to you, but communicating to your whole body, your whole physis, that you can move this way, you can do this, you can go up that hallway, you can go down that hallway, you can escape into this room, and so on and so forth. You can see how interactive our everyday experience is with the built environment and how susceptible it is to behavioral change through design. So so I think when you talk about the non-conscious experience in architectural and urban design, I think those are two key concepts: affordances and priming.
How do you think architecture and environment influence the way our identities are shaped?
Okay, let's talk about memory. One of the things that we have learned from cognitive neuroscientists from the late 1980s to today is back up. Let me say this a different way. Okay, when cognitive neuroscience is a very new discipline, really only started in the 70s, but really got off the ground in the 90s and so on. One of the first things that people began to study was memory. And there are a lot of different kinds of memory. There's motor memory, there's semantic memory, there's episodic memory, which is like autobiographical memories, so on. So when I say memory, I'm talking right now mainly about episodic memory, because it's episodic memory that relates to the stories that you tell yourself about your life. Okay, so we know more about memory than any other human cognitive operation, which isn't to say we know a lot, but we do know we do know the basics. And it was discovered in the mid-90s, that episodic memories were consolidated in that portion of the brain, which is called the hippocampus, which is also responsible for processing spatial navigation. Okay, so if you think about it, I mean, like the human brain is not necessarily a rationally constructed thing, right? But still, you think spatial navigation and autobiographical memory, like, how does that make sense? It's because our experience of our environments is so deeply embodied that when we have intense or memorable experiences, we are encoding as part of those experiences the physical locations or the aspects of physical locations in which those experiences took place. So maybe I feel the kind of nubby quality of the rug underneath my feet when my father tells me he's not going to pay for my last year of graduate school or whatever, so these things come together, and if you think about it, if you think about your autobiographical memories that are emotional, particularly your emotionally salient ones, it's pretty, I have yet to find a person who could say to me, Sarah, I found one that isn't connected to place. So I started thinking about this most because in the process of writing my last book, I moved from a suburb in Massachusetts, which was green and leafy and very nice, to East Harlem, which is a very poor neighborhood in Manhattan, in New York City, which has the highest density of social housing, public housing in the United States. And the public housing is terrible. It was terribly constructed, it's horribly maintained, and so on. And I would walk around, I was learning all this stuff about memory, and I would walk around and I think, what are these children learning about their experiences by having them in this space? Because everything about these buildings says to them, you don't matter. You are not important. And I began to realize that there's a there's a way in which the built environment is profoundly shaping people's identities in a way that doesn't go away, that you can overcome maybe, but it's some aspects of that, good or bad, and there are good examples too, are always going to be there.
My next question. Could you please tell about the range of individual and social necessities of a person, about which you write in the book Welcome to Your World, how the built environment shapes our lives?
I mean, I could say a lot of different things about this. I'm not quite sure what you're getting at. One thing I write about a lot in the last chapter is, you know, what are our goals for people? I mean, as I've said, you know, most architects, most people want other people to do well. I mean, they don't actively want to hurt other people, right? And so what does that even mean? Well, we are fortunate in that we have organizations like the UN that ask questions like that. Like, how do you judge how free a society is, right? We're a Freedom House. How do you judge how well people in a society are doing? And there's a couple of philosophers who wrote a book, Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, who work in human development and have consulted with the UN, and they came out with a book. I can't even remember the title. It's something about human capabilities, in which Amartya Sen did the first part of this, and then Nussbaum really did the second. Sen, who comes from India originally, argued that the UN was making a mistake by using measures of the progress of human development in different countries that looked only at the absence of negative things, like the absence of infant mortality, or the numbers around infant mortality, or life longevity, you know, how long the lifespan was, or incidences of preventable diseases. These are so-called negative factors. It's like you want as few negatives in a society as you can get, right? You want low infant mortality and so on and so forth. Okay, and he said, you know, that's not really telling us enough about who's doing well, because people need a lot more, and they need something different than that. What they need is, and this is where Nussbaum's work picks up, what they need is positive factors in their life that allow them to develop their potential. Their creative potential, their potential as individuals, their social potential, and so on. The word they use is not potential so much as capabilities. So whatever your capabilities are there factors in place in that society that encourage you to develop them? If you don't want to develop them, that's your choice, right? But the society should help you do that. And it's that gets back a little bit to what I mentioned earlier about humans needing autonomy. People don't do very well, and we know this in all sorts of ways, when they don't have some degree of control over the course of their lives, right? So this is another aspect of developing human capabilities. Some sense, I mean, even if it's wrong, even if it's fantasy, some sense that they are making decisions that have a significant impact on how their life goes. And so that brings up a whole nother set of responsibilities that lie within a society. If you're not only like there to prevent through public health measures things like infant mortality by making mothers do prenatal visits and stuff like that, but there to help people develop their own capabilities, then you move into the realm of the built environment. For some of the reasons that I just said when I talked about that social housing, public housing complex in New York that I used to walk by every day after I finished writing, because you can point to places like that and you can say that is not allowing people to develop their capabilities. And so we shift through this lens, we shift the whole discussion from an aesthetic discussion to an ethical and societal discussion. And that, I think, is a shift that, architecture and good design becomes not some kind of luxury bauble that you can, put on like you do an earring. It becomes a question of a profound question about human life and its living. Mm-hmm.
Could you please tell about your research methods which you use in your work, your research?
Well, I was trained, I have a PhD in architectural history and theory. And so I was not trained in the sciences. So I can tell you about the methods of a historian, which are basically to obsessively read everything that you can find and and I think that was really my methodology. It's not much of a methodology really in this book, which is I basically thought this is the set of issues that I'm interested in. I'm going to go to every discipline or different databases, basically, in the sciences and the social sciences and this and that, and pull anything that has anything about any of these factors and then see what I can synthesize. And I happen to, I did a good job synthesizing all that information, I can say. That's not, and I think that that is entirely valid. I wanted to shift the field to say, hey, you guys are all looking over there and you need to be looking there. And that's the kind of enterprise I was involved in. What needs to happen next is, well, they need to look over there. That's for one thing for sure, right? But the second thing is that there needs to be more studies about the built environment and the effect, its effects on people. And that has to be conducted, I think a lot of architects now get that anthropologists can be useful and maybe sociologists can be useful. These are studies that, if they could just like stretch a little further and go into environmental psychology and so on, then I think you begin to get a more complete picture. And so the methods I use are fine for what I wanted to do in that book. I'm now working with a cognitive neuroscientist and an environmental psychologist on a study to actually really study the impact of certain aesthetic factors on people's emotional sense of well-being and ability to focus. And that's much more scientifically grounded. But there are all sorts of issues when you're in environmental psychology is a complicated field because it's very difficult to control and in the way that you do in a scientific experiments when you're dealing with something as complicated as the built environment. But it's still important. And there are plenty of people doing it.
Maybe you would like to add something.
Your questions have been great. I can't think of anything that I would like to add, except that I hope a lot of people read it and go to your conferences.
Yes, I hope so. So, thank you so much for your time.